Hello and welcome to today's lecture. In today's lecture I'm going to be discussing Jonathan Bowden's speaking style. This is something I find quite interesting because Jonathan Bowden is very popular and has had a resurgence after his death. For those of you who don't know, Jonathan Bowden is was a prominent figure in the BNP, back when the BNP was a thing. And his ideas have had a bit of a resurgence, and I'm going to take a look at his speaking style and give my thoughts on it and explain what he does and how he does it. One thing Jonathan Bowden does in his speaking style is he uses a long introduction. I should know, for those of you who don't know, Jonathan Bowden normally speaks without notes, and it's quite effective speaking without notes, as I've explained in other lectures, but it's very hard to do. And Jonathan Bowden has said in interviews and in books, Pulp Fascism, I think he discusses this, he says he doesn't know what he's about to say 5 minutes before a speech and just riffs it. I'm not sure what my opinion is on that, because I find it quite hard to believe that anyone can give a speech for an hour and just riff it and have no planned structure. But Jonathan Bowden has very long introductions. Normally he says, good afternoon, good morning, thank you, and he goes from there. So his introduction will be an introduction that's quite interactive with the crowd, and then he'll start with the main topic. But what he'll do is he'll do a long introduction to it. And within that long introduction, he'll place tangents that he can go down, and he sort of outlines the rough structure of the speech throughout his introduction. And it's quite a clever technique, because what Jonathan Bowden does in his speeches is he goes off on a tangent a lot, but the way he speaks is he leaves himself lots of opportunities to go off on a tangent. And he's very good at starting and finishing sentences. So if you want to be able to speak without notes, it's very good. It'll be a very good idea for you to have some good sentence starters. Because if you don't have decent sentence starters, it's quite hard for you to flow when you talk. So that's something Jonathan Bowden does very well in his speaking style, and I'm not convinced that it's completely unrandom or completely random and he's just riffing it. I think he has an idea of what he's doing when he's speaking. Pace and volume. Jonathan Bowden has a very consistent pace when he's talking. I mean, I've watched probably about 10, 20 of his speeches that I've been able to find on YouTube, and what I've noticed is his pace and volume is pretty much the same regardless of what speech he's doing. I think this is quite important because Jonathan Bowden, when he speaks, he talks very quickly and very loudly. I've discussed the emotional impact of this, but I'll briefly go over it again. Normally, fast and loud speech normally creates strong emotions among the audience, and I think this is why he's so popular. It encourages the audience to feel joy and anxiety depending on the context of the speech. And normally, when someone's talking fast and loud, normally that'll raise the heart rates of the audience and increase the amount of cortisol they're producing and increase their stress levels. And it can also, if the speech is done right, also increase the joy that the audience feels. And this is the main reason I think Jonathan Bowden is so popular, because he talked very quickly, very loudly, and he had a strong emotional impact among the audience. Tangents. As I've previously said, within Jonathan Bowden's speech, or speeches, there are many opportunities for him to go off on a tangent. And he clearly knows a lot about the topics that he's giving talks on, but he just goes off on a tangent every 5 minutes or every couple of lines. And I think this is quite deliberate, because if you're doing a speech without notes, especially if the speech is something you know a lot about, it can be very hard to pick on the spot things that you want to discuss and consider which is the best way of presenting them. So Jonathan Bowden doesn't really do that. He just talks. Normally by the end of his introduction he'll have gone off on a tangent and works from there. He'll go off on another tangent and another tangent and another tangent, and because of how his speeches are presented, this has quite a positive effect on the audience, at least emotionally. Personally, in my opinion, I don't think tangents should be overused, because it's quite hard for Jonathan Bowden to express in-depth ideas and go over those ideas in any kind of detail, because going over a complex idea takes time. And Jonathan Bowden, in his speeches, will normally be talking about multiple topics, and he'll only normally spend about a minute talking about each topic, and he'll shoot in between topics, which it's quite an erratic structure, and that has quite a interesting impact in the audience because it builds suspense, and giving a speech that builds suspense and increases the emotional reactions or encourages strong emotions among the audience is going to be relatively well received, if not very well received, as opposed to talking using a consistent or neutral or volume or pace. I'm going to go through his erratic structure in more detail in the next slide, or his erratic themes. As I've said, his themes are very erratic during his speeches, and I can fully believe that he doesn't necessarily know what he's going to talk about. However, the way his speeches are structured so that he can go off on lots of tangents. So I think what is quite difficult for a lot of people to understand is there are ways of speaking without notes, and there are lots of tips to do it. So ancient Greek storytellers would have very specific structures which made memorizing stories a lot easier. So you've got ring composition and you've got mirroring, to name a few. Jonathan Bowden doesn't do that. He does tangenting, or what he does is he'll leave opportunities to just go off on one. And what seems to happen when he goes off on a tangent is he's normally run out of things to say. So he'll just go on and move topic. And because he talks in a very energetic way, it doesn't seem like he has no idea what he's doing, and it can be quite appealing actually. He also uses very dramatic language, which is to be expected, and the dramatic language is quite interesting, and I think it resonates with a lot of people when you use dramatic language, especially when people agree with you. And it's quite interesting to look at the words he uses, and I personally wouldn't recommend using the language that Jonathan Bowden uses unless you're talking within your echo chamber, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know lots of people have negative connotations with the word echo chamber, but I don't think you should. It's perfectly healthy to talk to people who agree with you. Jonathan Bowden interacts a lot with the audience and riffs off the audience, and this is something that lots of people do very well when they're making a speech without notes. So in a lot of his speeches you can usually only see him, not the audience, but you can see him looking at the audience and going off what the audience is saying and doing. And in my opinion, I think that's quite an interesting thing, because Jonathan Bowden, when he's speaking, when he's run out of things to say, he either goes off in a tangent or looks to the audience and gets an idea, and this is very workable and is a very good speaking style for certain circumstances. I forgot to put the slide in for this, but I'm going to talk about Jonathan Bowden's rhythmic structure. He's got a very consistent rhythmic structure throughout his speeches, which, in my opinion, and from what I know, having a consistent rhythmic structure makes it a lot easier, especially if that's the only way you deliver speeches. It makes it a lot easier with practice to just give a speech. And I'm very interested because Jonathan Bowden's speaking style is relatively unique, and the rhythmic structure he uses is relatively unique. He talks really loudly and really quickly, consistently, for about half an hour to an hour. And that's quite difficult for a lot of people to do. If any of you have ever done singing, talking really loudly and really quietly really loudly and really quickly is quite difficult to do. It takes lots of practice. So I don't think Jonathan Bowden is telling the truth when he says he hasn't and is naturally good at public speaking. He's clearly had some kind of training, whether that's formal or informal. He's clearly practiced. And what I'm trying to get at here is people can learn to talk like Jonathan Bowden. I mean, I go through, in some of my earlier lectures, pace and volume control. It also, with pace and volume control, it takes practice. So I've never met Jonathan Bowden, but from interviews from people who do know him, apparently his natural way of speaking was that loud. However, watching his speeches, I'm not sure that it is. I'm not sure he, in day-to-day life, would talk really loudly and really quickly. But I don't know. Jonathan Bowden also kept sentences very short, and he had very consistent pauses, which I think is quite interesting because the frequency to which you pause helps with structure, and Jonathan Bowden doesn't seem to go for anything longer than a sentence without a short pause, which is very good because he's very good at pausing and very good for pausing with effect. And in all probability, I think Jonathan Bowden is a very good speaker, and I can fully believe he did his speeches without notes, but I'm not convinced that he was just able to do it, because he uses some very subtle techniques that do help him when he's delivering a speech. Right, I'm going to move on to discussing the positives and negatives of Jonathan Bowden's speaking style. The strength of this speaking style is it's very engaging. Inspiring strong emotions among the audience is a very good thing to do in a speech, provided they're the right strong emotions and they're the right audience. Jonathan Bowden's speeches were very accessible in terms of who could watch them. In the old BNP days, in the speeches he gave, as far as I'm aware, you had everyone from intellectuals to brickies, and Jonathan Bowden's speaking style is very suited for that type of audience. The weaknesses of Jonathan Bowden's speaking style is it can come across demagogic, or it makes him seem like a demagogue. What the problem with seeming like a demagogue is, you couldn't speak using Jonathan Bowden's speaking style to lay people or people who aren't familiar with the ideas, because you'd trigger negative emotions in them. And as soon as you started talking in the way that Jonathan Bowden does, or used to, at best you'd get the audience members to switch off, and at worst you would cause them to leave. Getting audience members to leave or triggering them to leaving, though it might be enjoyable for you and it might be funny, is not really very appropriate if you're going to be giving a speech where being well received is important. So I will use the example of a council meeting. If you're opposing the building of a migrant centre or a migrant processing centre in your village, you don't want to give a speech like Jonathan Bowden, because there will be people who disagree with you, and what you're going to do by speaking in that way is encourage them to write you off when they may not necessarily have written you off. Because someone's speaking style, if they speak like Jonathan Bowden, it's only really appropriate for people who agree with you. It's not appropriate really for normies, because speaking in that way is likely to encourage negative emotions. So if you want people on your side and you want to persuade people, talking like Jonathan Bowden probably isn't a good idea. I'm just going to go over everything again and flash through it and with suggestions and tips. How to do a good introduction. I've done a video on this, but if you want to do a long introduction and leave yourself opportunities to go off on tangents, you need to get a decent vocabulary together and become familiar with speaking in leading sentences. I mean, everyone's heard of leading questions, but you want to speak in leading sentences that have many opportunities for you to go in the speech. Pace and volume. I've got pace and volume control exercises, which I suggest you check out on practice. Tangents. The key thing you need to do to be good at running and going off on a tangent is know a lot about your topic. So I'd only recommend going off on a tangent if you know a lot about the topic. But as I've said previously, you can't really discuss very deep and intellectual ideas if you're always going off on a tangent. If you want to give a brief outline of a topic, by all means, structure your speech in such a way and use sentences that the meaning isn't necessarily clear. But if you're going for a speaking style that is extremely complex and you're talking about a very complex topic, it's not really going to help the audience if you suddenly go off on a tangent. Erratic structure. What you need to do here is get used to talking in a way that is very erratic and get used to thinking in a way that is very erratic, and then you should be able to go off on good tangents. Dramatic language. Use a thesaurus and obviously take notes on better words for things and more dramatic words for things. That should help you get good at using dramatic language, and also practice it in your day-to-day life. Interaction. Jonathan Bowden is a very charismatic individual. If you want to improve your audience interaction, you need to become more charismatic. What I'd suggest for that is be more social. Get better at reading body language. Also, learning to make jokes can be helpful. Thank you very much for watching, people. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed doing the research for this. Thank you very much for watching. Please check out the other videos. And good night. God bless.